Before 1959, half of all children had no schools or education. The average wage of farm workers was 25 cents a day. Only 4% of the people in the countryside could afford to eat meat. And yet, hundreds of thousands of acres of land were owned by U.S. corporations like United Fruit Company, which grew vast amounts of food for export, while people went hungry in Cuba.
This embargo against Cuba, which is really about strangling the Cuban people, strangling a whole nation, starving out a whole nation here.
The United States is a very wealthy country, but people suffer from lack of adequate health care. And Cuba, a small and poor country, yet its people are guaranteed free and easy access to quality health care.
The School Supplies for Cuban Children campaign was launched by youth across the U.S. who organized for months to collect pencils and paper and to spread awareness of the U.S. blockade of Cuba.
A perspective on Cuba which the media and the government do not want you to see. But we'll show it to you right now on Alternative Views. On this Alternative Views program, we have a documentary called Against All Odds, and it shows Cuba in a much different light than what you get from the establishment media and the government. We'll show you this documentary after we present to you a few news stories which we've gleaned from the alternative press.
We remember Clinton was saying that, well, our bailout of Mexico isn't a real bailout because we're going to make the Mexicans set aside as collateral all of the oil reserves that they have down there. Of course, Mexico has a national oil company, Pemex. It's not in the hands of the multinational oil companies. But there are a couple of people who say this just isn't going to work out. One is John Westergaard, who publishes a financial newsletter. This, by the way, is from a column by Robert Metz from United Feature Syndicate. Westergaard says that there really won't be much money left over once the costs associated with the revenues, these oil revenues, are deducted from the total. And then another expert, John Lichtblau, who's chairman of the Petroleum Industry Research Foundation, he says it's true that Mexico has substantial reserves, but Mexico is producing only 2.5 million barrels of oil a day and has no excess capacity. And roughly 1 million barrels a day are exported to the United States. So to pay on the new loans that Clinton has given them, Mexico would have to divert oil from domestic uses or from other nations that already buy the oil if they want to prop up the Mexican economy and pay off the American debts. Well, this isn't going to work. So Westergaard says that he fears another run on the peso once this $50 billion runs out. He says that foreigners look at the dollar and realize now that a large segment of our export sales are actually leases, not sales, but actually leases to a lessee who's unable to keep up the payments. And once people realize this, that they'll even be more skeptical of the dollar's worth. So in this scenario, the whole thing could pull the dollar down even further. Oh, that NAFTA thing has really been a disaster, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse.
There's an article in these Times that talks about the BLO, which is the Barbie Liberation Organization.
The Barbie doll?
The Barbie.
Liberation Organization.
Right. They actually had a resurgence over the holidays.
Oh, God.
And they're the group that actually was responsible, or claims responsibility for switching the voice boxes in the G.I. Joe dolls and the Barbie dolls a couple of years ago. And the head, it's called arts activist Igor Vamos, says, we encourage shop giving. We purchase the dolls, surgically enhance them, and replace them on the shelves. The retailer sells the item twice, and the consumer gets a more interesting product.
Well, what were types of things that they switched? Not having any Barbie dolls myself, what would they sound like?
Well, what they actually did is they put the G.I. Joe, the G.I. Joe would actually say, you know, I don't like math, and but he'd say in a girl's voice, I don't like math very much, and then the Barbie dolls would say, you know, in response, you know, something like, oh, you know, I want to go out and fight, or, you know,
go kick butt.
Yeah, go kick some butt. And
so G.I. Joe would be talking like Barbie.
Yeah, G.I. Joe would have the little girl, the Barbie's voice, and she would have his. But you know, the purpose, of course, you know, was to break, you know, stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and it seems to be a pretty humorous way to accomplish it.
That means I'm more like Barbie then, because I don't like math and I don't like to kick butt. I guess I might start talking like this. Oh, God. On Alternative Views, we've been telling you about how the former communists have been elected to power, or at least to office, in Eastern European states, where they're after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they decided they were going to try free market capitalism, and it's resulted in such a disaster that the people have voted the old communists back in. Now, the communists are not saying they're communists, they're calling themselves democratic socialists, and have moderated their views considerably and more democratized their views. But nonetheless, it shows that the people are dissatisfied with what is happening as a result of their experiment with capitalism, and they're putting the old boys back into power. Well, the same thing has happened to a certain extent in Finland. According to the Associated Press, that the Finnish voters were angered by the government's welfare cuts during Finland's rule by their Conservative Party, and has resulted in an enormous recession there. So they gave the Social Democratic Party its biggest election in 50 years, win in 50 years. Now, they don't have a majority. They're still going to have to work with some of the other parties. They only got 28%. But it does show that the people don't like all this unrepentant and running rampant capitalism. I wonder when the American people are going to wise up.
Evidence is accumulating which indicates that unleaded petrol could be more damaging than leaded, and which could be causing new waves of cancer and adding to the degradation of the environment. A decrease in the use of leaded petrol has been a positive outcome, but the alternative chosen by the oil companies and the government could turn out to be more of a problem. Unleaded petrol is more expensive to make and results in the use of more oil and creates more pollution because of the aromatics which are added as a replacement for lead. The additives, which make up over 50% of the petrol, includes benzene, which is linked to childhood leukemia. All the additives are known carcinogens. In Sydney's Central Business District, the worst recorded levels of benzene have been over 2,500% over the recommended levels of pollution. This situation raises serious questions about businesses and governments who make decisions on matters of the environment and environmental concern in their own interests, where they should be made by and for in the interests of people and the community they live in. The best way to ensure this will occur is to have the community control over government decisions.
Here's another little GATT story that we warned you about, but people don't seem to know much about it. The Spotlight had it, said that the public is unaware of the fact that there is a little domestic tax measure, which is buried in the GATT package that they didn't talk about. The proponents of GATT didn't talk about. But what is happening is that someplace they're going to have to make up with taxes for the amount of revenue which is going to be lost as a result of lowering of tariff barriers. The Office of Management and Budget itself said that the tariffs, the lowering of tariffs, will cause a loss of $32 billion in the U.S. Treasury. $11 billion over the next 5 years and $20 billion for the subsequent 5 years. So GATT contained this little item of domestic tax increases specifically designed to offset the cost of GATT. So, as usual, the big boys, the financial people and big business, they get the benefits from GATT, and the taxpayers, the little people, you and I, are going to have to pay for it. They get the profits, we get the costs.
An article in the Multinational Monitor covers the fact that the pesticide company political action committees, PACs, doubled their campaign contributions to Congress after a high-stakes federal court loss in 1992 threatened to ban dozens of cancer-causing pesticides. Most of the pesticide PAC cash has gone to members of Congress who have co-sponsored the pesticide industry's bill to weaken federal pesticide law. Over half of the House of Representatives, 224 members, now co-sponsor the pesticide industry bill, and 17 senators sponsor the measure too.
There have been several articles in the Spotlight over the past many weeks wondering what is going on. And we've reported this to you on Alternative Views, the fact that Russian military hardware has been seen in various places in the United States. Some of them set up statically in different bases, and some of them have been seen being towed or carried down roadways, some on railroad trains. And some people have seen former Soviet airplanes and helicopters. First, the Pentagon denied this was happening, and then people were taking pictures of all this stuff. I mean, many of some of the latest pieces of military hardware, personnel carrier, tanks, and all of this. Well, what's it doing here? Well, the Pentagon first said, well, after they finally admitted, they said, well, these are just museum pieces, and we're here just to test them out. But nobody really knows what is happening. But also we know that the United States is training Russian special forces in the United States in various places, in crowd control, in helping undermine third world countries or even places in the Soviet Union, covert actions. And lo and behold, some of these people have wound up being seen and photographed in Chechnya, where the Soviets are trying to put down the uprising by the Chechen people. How do they know this? Well, some of the people are in the uniforms which they used when they were being trained in the United States, and has in English the fact that a very special patch which indicated that they were. So now there is speculation. In fact, some people have said they have actually seen American advisors in Chechnya serving with the Russian troops.
We'll have more news stories later on Alternative Views, but now let's see our documentary about Cuba.
Isla de un pueblo aguerrido, coraje y amor unidos, siempre estaré junto a ti, a Cuba de Guillén y Martí.
You can't play games with people's lives. You can't hold a whole country hostage. We have to demand that the United States respect the dignity and rights of the Cuban people. To deprive any human on this earth of needed nutrition and medicine is a violation of humanitarian law and has been for generations. It's a continuing crime against humanity. It's the United States alone.
In opposition to the U.S. blockade of Cuba, the International Peace for Cuba Appeal delivered $2 million worth of insulin and antibiotics to the Cuban Red Cross in an effort to help sustain Cuba's quality healthcare system. The delegation was headed by Ramsey Clark and medical doctors who were there to assess the effects of the blockade on healthcare in Cuba.
The U.S. blockade was imposed after the Cuban Revolution, when the Cuban people began charting an independent course and attempting to use their resources, the natural resources of their country, for their own development and benefit. And this was not particularly liked by many U.S. corporations that were being nationalized, nor the U.S. government. But to understand how all of this took place, we need to take a look at Cuban history. To go back to the 1950s, when rebels under the leadership of Fidel Castro were leading a campaign against the oppressive dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista.
On January 1st, 1959, Cuban revolutionaries overthrew the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. After 7 years of struggle in which over 20,000 young Cubans lost their lives at the hands of the military regime. At that time, Cuba was typical of Latin America: high unemployment and crushing poverty amidst the growing wealth of a minority of rich landowners. Before 1959, half of all children had no schools or education. The average wage of farm workers was 25 cents a day. Only 4% of the people in the countryside could afford to eat meat. And yet, hundreds of thousands of acres of land were owned by U.S. corporations like United Fruit Company, which grew vast amounts of food for export, while people went hungry in Cuba. U.S. big business was the largest owner of Cuba's resources, of the oil refineries, the mines, 75% of the sugar plantations, the railroads, telephone and utility companies, and the banks. All this had helped create the hunger, illiteracy, and discontent of the Cuban people. The rebels who fought in the Sierra Maestra Mountains of eastern Cuba were members of the July 26 movement. The July 26 movement was an organization led by a dynamic young activist in the university who later launched the struggle against Batista. His name was Fidel Castro. The July 26 movement included workers, students, peasants who felt that their only chance for a decent life, for a job, education, food, and housing was by overthrowing the hated dictatorship of Batista and establishing a new society. January 1st ushered in the new year 1959. It was also the first day of the Cuban Revolution. Within the first few months of the new revolutionary government, rents and utility rates were lowered 30 to 50% for the population. The cost of medical care was reduced and later made free. Racism was banned, and beaches, restaurants, and other public places, many of which were once off limits to the poor, were now open to all Cubans. The new government made a commitment to provide jobs and education to all Cubans. But what angered the U.S. government most of all was that the new Cuban government gave land to poor peasants, and huge land holdings were cut down to size. 5 U.S. companies alone had owned 2 million acres before the Agrarian Reform Law was passed. In retaliation, the U.S. government under President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy began to wage an economic and military campaign against Cuba.
Anti-Castro leaflets are scattered over the city by a plane based in the United States.
In the early months of 1960, several air flights originating from the U.S. bombed sugarcane fields and sugar mills. These military attacks would increase in the future. The Soviet Union and Cuba signed a major trade agreement. The Soviet Union would supply Cuba with crude oil, wheat, and fertilizers, and purchase 5 million tons of sugar from Cuba over 5 years. In June of 1960, the Soviet Union sent its first shipment of oil to Cuba. In Cuba, the U.S. and British-owned refineries refused to refine the crude oil. After a 3-week standoff and faced with the possibility of running out of fuel, Cuba announced that it would nationalize the refineries of Texaco, Esso, and Standard. Mass rallies of the population backed up the decision to nationalize the refineries and other industries. People began to feel that Cuba's resources were now in the hands of the Cuban people, so that all could benefit. Several days later, U.S. Congress passed a law to cut off Cuba's sugar quota sales to the U.S. One popular saying in Cuba at the time was, "Cuba, without a quota but free of a boss." China agreed to buy 500,000 tons of sugar from Cuba each year for the next 5 years. One autumn day in 1960, a historic speech by Fidel Castro was delivered to over 1 million people who gathered at Revolution Square in Havana. It was September 2nd, 1960. Fidel expressed the right of Cuba to decide its own foreign policy and to have economic and political relations with China and the Soviet Union. This declaration said, "The National General Assembly of Cuba proclaims the right of children to an education, the right of the sick to medical care, the right of black and indigenous people to full human dignity, the right of women to civil, social, and political equality." And CIA began training a military force of right-wing Cubans in order to invade Cuba. The country prepared itself against invasion.
The U.S. role was supposed to remain a secret. In fact, at a camp in Guatemala, the CIA was training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. They landed in a swamp called the Bay of Pigs.
In February of 1962, Kennedy imposed an economic blockade. He signed a decree banning all economic trade between the U.S. and Cuba. The intent was to try to strangle the country. He also made it illegal for U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba. But the military attacks were not over. The CIA made new plans for a massive military operation called Operation Mongoose.
So they made landings on those islands, the Marines did, to show Castro that we had the power to invade if we wanted to.
In response, the Soviet Union offered to provide Cuba with artillery, training, and tactical nuclear weapons. Cuba accepted. The confrontation that followed in October 1962 became known in the U.S. as the October Missile Crisis. Kennedy threatened war against the Soviet Union that would have engulfed the world in a nuclear holocaust if the missiles were not removed from Cuba. The Pentagon encircled Cuba with a total naval blockade. Cuba insisted on its right to defend the island from the U.S. military might. Kennedy was under pressure from the Pentagon to launch an attack.
I think Kennedy had made up his mind, but the Air Force kept wanting to bomb. Well, before they were through, they had a massive air attack planned that would have practically wiped Cuba off the face of the earth.
At the last moment, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to the Soviet Union's demand that the Pentagon abandon its plan to invade Cuba.
Well, you know, the attacks haven't really let up since 1962. They've just taken other forms, primarily economic, I think, in the form of a blockade, this embargo against Cuba, which is really about strangling the Cuban people, strangling a whole nation, starving out a whole nation here. And I think the blockade has really been intensified in recent years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was Cuba's chief trading partner, and I think the United States is trying to really build a noose around the whole nation of Cuba and to starve the people into submission.
Otros países no trataran de gobernarnos suciamente. Que si quisiesen hacer amigos de nosotros, ser limpios, no sucios, de tratarnos como esclavos, como nosotros no podemos hacerlo.
I couldn't help but compare a simple fact over and over again while I was in Cuba. The fact that the United States is a very wealthy country, but people suffer from lack of adequate health care. And Cuba, a small and poor country, yet its people are guaranteed free and easy access to quality health care, particularly during this special period that, due to the United States blockade, enormous hardship and scarcity are prevailing in Cuba.
I visited the Cerro Hospital, pediatric hospital in Havana, which is one of the oldest children's hospitals in the nation, and visited their intensive care unit. One of the doctors there told us that the machine they use to analyze certain chemicals in the blood, specifically what they call blood gases, it measures the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. That machine had been broken for at least 6 months because a certain instrument called the pH electrode was broken. That part came from Denmark, but because this company that produced the equipment also had trade relations with the United States and the United States Company Office, Cuba was forbidden from purchasing that part because of the embargo. As a pediatrician, I think this is criminal, because why should children suffer for something for which they have no blame, no control, and in the first place it's not their fault or any Cuban's fault to begin with?
There are anti-leucemic drugs that are only produced by firms of the United States of America, and because of this Torricelli law, there is no possibility for us to buy this drug. So there are children suffering from leukemia that cannot have their medical treatment because of this situation.
The Torricelli Law, or the so-called Cuban Democracy Act, was signed into law by President Bush in 1992 and is named after Robert Torricelli, a New Jersey congressman. This law has tightened the blockade even more by threatening sanctions against other countries if they trade with Cuba. It also says that any ship in the world which docks in a Cuban harbor is then prohibited from docking in a U.S. port for 6 months. One of the most severe effects is that the Torricelli Law has cut off virtually all remaining trade between Cuba and U.S. subsidiaries which operate from third countries.
The Torricelli Law has cut Cuba's imports from the United States from 900 million per year to something like 1.6 million. And when you consider that the majority of these imports, 90% of these imports, are basically food and medicine, I think that tells you something about the nature of this law and the nature of the embargo in general. I mean, it's just completely inhuman.
¿Qué es lo que pensaron cuando recibieron la llamada sobre la insulina? que iba a venir?
Muy contentos porque la insulina es muy importante en nuestro país. Tenemos muchos pacientes insulino dependientes y realmente alivia la situación que tenemos con la insulina. Alivia mucho.
Juan Palmero dijo y no es mentira que me pusiera pronto malopina. Es la revista que anda en el ambiente, se la sabe toda. ¡Uy, qué gente!
Cargamento importante de insulina de la empresa Lilly, de muy buena calidad, la cual debe cubrir el 100% de los diabéticos en Cuba durante un mes.
The insulin made a tremendous difference. It was a big help. But Cuba can't rely on donations alone to satisfy their needs for medicines. They should have the right to trade freely, and the blockade is preventing that. Shipping costs are so extraordinarily expensive that if they had trade with the U.S., they could save considerable dollars by buying from a country that's only 90 miles away rather than going all the way to Europe or other countries where the costs are much more expensive.
So how do you think the people in the U.S. can help?
Convincing their government to have a normal relation with us. There's no reason why not to have a normal relation between two countries that are neighbors, respecting each one the other one.
I just know like the stuff that they tell us in history class, but that's from the U.S. point of view, so I want to go there so I can see for myself, because it's different from what they tell you and what it really is.
Can you collect 100 pencils? How will you get them? How can we get them?
Go to the store and get all their pencils.
Okay. And can you help on that? And then where are we going to send them?
Cuba.
For Cuban Children campaign was launched by youth across the U.S. who organized for months to collect pencils and paper and to spread awareness of the U.S. blockade of Cuba. For more than 30 years, the U.S. government has imposed a blockade against the whole people of Cuba, and with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, Cuba's biggest trading partner, the U.S. blockade's effect has caused severe shortages of fuel, food, and medicine. The U.S. youth have worked very hard to collect school supplies, and in the spring of 1994, the first youth delegation of the School Supplies Campaign traveled to Cuba to deliver the supplies and express their solidarity with the Cuban youth.
The kids are the first priority there, and there's such a difference because in the United States, the kids the kids don't feel like, like the government doesn't really care for them. But in Cuba, everything is based on the kids. I mean, the education, the health, the government, everything is based so the kids can grow up and, really make a difference to the country.
Students at Lenin School learn sciences like chemistry and physics, as well as literature, music, culture, and sports. They also work in agricultural part of the day to produce some of their own food. They cultivate their own herbal medicines to overcome the shortages of medicine. Everyone on the delegation was impressed by Lenin's high school. There wasn't any graffiti on the walls. It was clean. The teachers and students were very respectful. It was a lot different than the U.S. schools.
Que ustedes nos están preguntando, precisamente lo hemos querido también sumar aquí a la propaganda.
Okay. That in a lot of their propaganda and a lot of their advertisements, the youth show a lot of condoms to promote using condoms, especially for the reasons that we were asking them about what do you do about birth control and do the youth use it or not. So they do this as a, to promote using condoms, especially within the youth and within themselves.
Wherever we went in Cuba, we could see the effects of the U.S. blockade and economic crisis. The transportation breaking down, lack of fuel, and frequent blackouts. The U.S. government is trying to force all countries to stop trading with Cuba. Now people lack spare parts for tractors and fertilizers for crops, which ultimately leads to a lack of food. In the William Soler Children's Hospital, the doctors told us of the extra high cost of medicine because Cuba has to buy medicines from so far away.
The cost for a visit to a physician is provided for by the Cuban government. The costs for medicines are covered. The costs for hospital care also are covered. So if a person has to be hospitalized for an illness, the hospital bed is paid for, the nursing care, and the medications.
Even the beautiful Cuban culture is affected by the crisis.
Is it a hard time getting supplies?
¿Es difícil para ustedes conseguir materiales de arte?
Un poco.
Yes, it is. Because of the blockade and the embargo.
En este momento es muy difícil.
At this point, it's extremely difficult.
Like kids in the United States, they'll be like, yeah, we want to watch cartoons and we want to see Barney and stuff. But here they be like the blockade and they're all into socialism and stuff and all into the government. Kids in the U.S., they don't even know, they probably don't even know the president's name. But here they know everything. It seems like they study a lot, like read a lot of books, pay attention to things, try to understand it.
They talk like grown-ups, little grown-ups, where they have their little accents and pronunciation and everything. Even the little kids in the swimming pool that we were swimming with, the way they were talking, they were like, yeah, like they were well educated. Like
the impression most people in the States have of the Cuban people is that they are unhappy or oppressed. Americans visualize a military presence in the streets when they think of Cuba, but it's not like that at all. I mean, yeah, there's hardships the Cubans are enduring, but with such spirit. The blockade will end someday, and in the meantime, it hasn't kept the Cuban people and government from celebrating life, providing for the children, and giving every child the opportunity to succeed, no matter what color or sex they are. Education is 100% free in Cuba, so is health care. There's so much respect among the people. It was hard for a lot of us coming back to the U.S., a country with such different ideals, a society of violence and distrust. There's so much change to be made, it's overwhelming. We don't know what else to do but fight for the changes and help our Cuban friends that have taught us so much.
Well, we know where we're going, but we don't know where we've been. And we know what we're knowing, but we can't say what we've seen. And we're not little children, and we know what we want, and the future is certain. Give us time to work it out.
If you're a youth, join our campaign. Organize at your school and collect school supplies. Call us to learn more about the Cuban youth. Help us end this blockade.
Let's return now to some news stories which you didn't see on regular television. These stories come mainly from the alternative press.
In the Tulsa World, there was an article by Morrow, who is actually an editorial writer for the Wichita, Kansas Eagle. She talks about religious bigotry and the big thing that the religious right nuts want to do now of forcing prayer in the schools. She talked about her situation in 1949 in her grade school. They were given a religious lesson every day, and it was given by a Protestant. And there were a few Catholic kids there, so they had to go sit out in the hallway while the rest of them were being instructed on the right way to live. Well, one day they had a representative of the Women's Christian Temperance Union who was leading the devotional, and she was telling the people about all the evils of drinking. I remember one of these occurred in my junior high, and they would always do this experiment where they would take a glass of whiskey and put some worms in the whiskey, and of course the worms would all die. And then they'd have a glass of water, and they'd put some other worms in the water, and the worms would swim happily around and say, "Okay, children, what does this teach you?" And children are supposed to say, "Don't drink whiskey because it'll hurt your body." And then there's some kid that always say, "No, it means that if you have worms, you want to drink whiskey." But anyway, Morrow told the story about what they did that, and she said, "Well, won't a worm die if you drop it in Coca-Cola too?" Well, that wasn't the right thing to say, so they tossed her out of the class, and they sent her out to be with the Catholics. So she started talking with the Catholics, who were excluded, of course, and so she got to start talking with them and started to understand how they felt about all this. And then years later, when Morrow was a teacher, some of her Jewish students came by, and they said that they didn't like to be forced to go to the Easter pageant that the school had because they felt uncomfortable and wondering if they could be excused from it. But they were forced to sit in anyway. and to a program which vilified their religion and praising another. And they said, actually, that was worse than the poor Catholic kids who at least they were able to sit out in the hall. So the lesson which Myrna learned was in relationship to what's going on today. She says that the current school prayer movement is a way of saying that only one religious view has credibility, and that anyone who thinks otherwise deserves to be uncomfortable. And no matter who pays the taxes, it means that everybody has to go and listen to the group, what the group who writes the prayers has to say. And this group also not only writes the prayers, but they have a corner on who God is and how best to worship Him. And the people who don't agree with the content of these prayers are led to believe that they're unworthy, at least not as worthy as the prayer writers are. Their beliefs aren't as relevant, and their dignity isn't important. And she said, you know, it may seem like a long way between this type of bigotry as from forcing Catholic children to leave the classroom and forcing Jewish kids to stay in the religious ceremony of Easter. There may be a big step between there and what happened to the Jews in Germany in World War II. But the basic disregard for the humanity of those who don't share somebody else's beliefs is there just as well. And one act of intolerance piled on top of another over and over and over and continuously, well, maybe could ultimately lead to the greatest malevolence.
A May article in these Times reports that federal tax dollars, some $3 million of them, subsidized a decade-long diversity awareness training program at the Department of Transportation that allegedly encouraged blacks and whites to hurl verbal abuse at one another and lead one employee to be hospitalized for depression. The training session, led by a Pacific Northwest guru who claims to channel an ancient spirit named Ramtha, included participants being physically tied to co-workers for hours and being required to strip down to their underwear in front of co-workers and reveal their deep-seated problems.
In the January 3rd edition of the Spotlight, there's an incredible story about stuff that is very important, but you didn't get it in the United States media. Seemed like there was an international meeting of police chiefs and ministers of justice from 79 nations. It was in Naples, Italy, in December of 1994. But what they have figured out was, looking at the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, that the present Russia is not run by bungling bureaucrats, but managed by international bankers of the worldwide Rockefeller network in collusion with international mafia. How'd the Spotlight get this information? Well, they had a friend at the UN, because it was UN-sponsored report, but they didn't release it to the media, but this information was given to them. The documents reveal a deep concern over the deluge of financial crime flooding the continent from Russia. In 1984, there were 4 banks in the entire Soviet Union. They took care of everything. They were tightly controlled. But in 1994, there are nearly 4,000 private banks in Russia, and a lot of these are just fronts for organized crime and international money laundering rings. But the most worrisome part, according to this study, was that the new international crime wave has the involvement of Chase Manhattan Bank and all of the Rockefeller financial empire. When joint operation by Italian, Swiss, French, and American investigators broke this enormous drug operation back in 1980s, the trail led back to Chase Manhattan headquarters in New York, where cocaine couriers dumped suitcases full of cash for laundering. And Chase Manhattan and other money centers of the banks They did this anonymously through Russian subsidiaries controlled by frontman. This is what the conference concluded. But it's just not narcotics. I mean, there's a big booming enterprise in car thefts, and so a lot of this money has to be laundered, and here come the big banks to do it. And under tutelage of the merger-minded international bankers, well, guess what? The mob from all over the world has been merging. There was a story we had in Alternative Views many months ago about the Colombian drug cartel guys got together with the Italian mafia and the newly emerging Russian mafia, and they are going to work together and smooth out things, make sure they don't get each other's way, and make sure they've got good profits. And they also are in connection with the Chinese mafia, so-called the Chinese triads. So that's international finance, folks. And you know that the mafia wouldn't be able to last very long at all without the collusion of the big banks, particularly in Wall Street, doing the money laundering for them.
You recall that Yeltsin, when he became the president of Russia, talked about democracy, legality, human rights, liberalization, the goals of the Soviet dissident movement, which he said were also the goals of his administration. Well, after a lot of his parliamentary shenanigans, where he would attempt to close down Congress, the parliament in Russia, if he didn't like their decisions, or he would falsify elections and attempt to invalidate them if he didn't like the results. We also learn now that there's been a lot of human rights abuses and a failure to take democracy seriously by Yeltsin and his administration, all of which has been carefully documented in a 90-page report prepared by the President's Committee on Human and Civil Rights that's headed by the eminent human rights activist and former political prisoner Sergei Kovalev, who was one of Yeltsin's early supporters, who has now criticized the Yeltsin regime for violating a whole lot of civil liberties, including their constitutional right to move freely and to choose one's residency. It paints a chilling picture of conditions in the armed forces where soldiers are treated like chattel, beaten, fed rotten food, compelled to moonlight in order to eat, and prevented from voicing complaints by threat of punishment. For instance, in 1993 alone, according to this report, 2,572 soldiers died for unexplained reasons. 9,294 were traumatized. 462 committed suicide. As the report notes, not a single army in the world has suffered non-combat casualties on such a scale. Moreover, it exposed the conditions in prisons and other places of detention where there were brutal beatings, overcrowding, lack of elementary health care, deprivation of access to fresh air or contacts with the outside world or lawyers or the like. But probably the most devastating are the charges regarding the behavior of Russian military and police forces during the state emergency imposed by Yeltsin in Moscow last October, where there were serious attempts to challenge his regime. The official line is that it was Yeltsin's enemies that ran amok, shooting and beating helpless civilians, and that they were fascists and anti-Semites, etc. Whereas the report by the Human Rights Commission in Russia said it was Yeltsin's soldiers who caused most of the casualties, often shooting at unarmed civilians, and it was the soldiers and police that were dragging people into detention, clubbing them, and hurling anti-Semitic curses at them. The soldiers were also rounding up suspicious-looking people that were mainly dark-skinned Armenian or other Soviet national minorities, etc., that if they didn't have the right papers were deported or sent to concentration camps and the like. And evidently, according to a report in The Nation of September the 12th of 1994, this report has been ignored both by Yeltsin's official media in the Soviet Union, but also the media in the United States. Some oppositional newspapers have leaked and discuss some of the results of the report in the Soviet Union, or in the former Soviet Union, Russia, but in the United States this has been pretty much ignored. And the Clinton administration, of course, has been basically pro-Yeltsin, giving Yeltsin's government all sorts of programs and supports, and they have not publicized any of these violations of human rights by the Yeltsin administration.
How close are we getting to be a Big Brother land? Well, we know that some people who are out on parole have to wear little things around their wrists or their ankle, which the authorities can track, so that they put out a little signal and the authorities can track to make sure they're in town. Well, we're getting a little bit closer here, according to the Spotlight. Washington, 6 states, including Texas, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, New Mexico. There's a new highway electronic surveillance system that permits state agents to monitor the location of vehicles, commercial vehicles, that have been mounted with a special transponder that communicates with plates that are buried in the highway. The state can thereby monitor the vehicle's computer and verify their location at any time. Now, of course, some people, according to the Spotlight, critics call them fear-mongers and you know, terrible paranoids. They fear that such technology could be used privately for all government-owned passenger vehicles and even the rest of us. Can you imagine putting a little transponder maybe in your tag of your car, and then they would be able to keep track of everybody? Paranoid? Well, there have been a lot of things that people have been accused of being paranoid about in the past that have come into being. This is just part of the future, folks.
And that's Alternative Views for this time. Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications, which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. We have a lot of people to thank for helping us with our program. Our crew people were Brian Lynch, Ariel Powell, Susan Millison, Kevin L. West, and Eric Eubank. For our news section from Australia, it came from Actively Radical TV, and there are their phone number and their fax number. That's in Sydney, Australia. And the People's Video Network provided us with our documentary on Cuba. Their phone number is 212-633-6646. And you can contact the International Action Center at either of their 2 locations. One is in New York City, the other in San Francisco. There's their address and phone number in New York City. And here is the address and phone number of the International Action Center in San Francisco. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.